It's quite interesting that you use the term gas chambers, because obviously you're trying to kind of evoke...
well, what are they? These are chambers that are filled with gas that are used to kill pigs.
Because I think you're obviously trying to evoke a kind of cultural memory.
Our next witness is Ed Winters, who's a vegan activist and campaigner and author of How to Argue with a Meat Eater and Win Every Time. Well, I suppose we'll see about that. Look, if I was sitting here in front of you now, well, I'm sitting in front of you now, but I was tucking into, bought by the BBC, a meltingly tender, medium rare ribeye steak instead of a half-empty packet of crisps, which is what we actually got here. But if I got the steak in front of me, how would you categorise that as a moral act?
Well, I would categorise it as an immoral act. I think when we exist in a world where we have the choice to not do these things to animals, to not force them into gas chambers, to not cut their throats, to not exploit them, when we have a choice to not do these things ethically and morally, to not inflict unnecessary violence onto someone else is the ethically preferable thing to do. So, firstly, I certainly wouldn't pay for my BBC licence again if you were tucking into a steak paid for by the BBC, but secondary to that, I would still accuse you of being immoral because you've caused violence to an animal that you didn't need to.
Tim Stanley?
You got crisps? Okay. Ed, listening to the farmer has made me a vegetarian, but you're a vegan,
Yes.
so you go a little bit further. Right. This is what intrigues me about veganism and that I want to get into. You are presumably against products which derive from animals. Now, when I was young, we used to keep chickens, and these chickens were the best looked after chickens in the world. They had loads of place to run around, lots of grain, we even fed them worms, it was great. And occasionally they would produce eggs, and we would eat them. What is the possible ethical objection to me eating this natural byproduct of a chicken which has not been fertilised and which they have no good for?
Yeah, I think it's a very good argument in the sense of, obviously when we talk about the immorality of certain actions, there are degrees of harm and suffering involved. And so, of course, a situation such as that isn't comparable to the situation that most people partake in, which is by buying eggs that have come from sort of commercial farming units, whether they be free-range, organic or otherwise. And so in such a scenario, I don't necessarily know that I can make a compelling argument against the decision that you make in that moment if, of course, these animals were rescued from a farm, are given a very good life, are not going to be killed prematurely. And maybe certain things have been done to try and encourage those hens to eat their own eggs, for example. They can replace lost nutrients by consuming their own eggs. So there are things that I would recommend doing over consuming those eggs yourself.
Right.
But of course, when you talk about the ethical conundrum there, it is far more ethical than what most people buy.
But you wouldn't personally eat the egg, would you?
No, I would feed it back to the hens. Laying an egg, it requires a huge number of nutrients, a lot of nutrients for these hens. So by feeding the egg back to the hen, it allows them to replace those lost nutrients.
Right.
Because as you maybe already know, hens have been selectively bred to lay sort of 300 plus eggs a year, and that takes a huge toll on their body. And if we can try and replace those lost nutrients,
but mine didn't do that. You see, this is my point. I just cannot. From a layman's point of view, I just can't see the moral objection to me eating that egg.
But it's a little bit of a red herring in the sense of I'm not necessarily here to compel you to not eat that egg.
Right.
What I'm here to try and compel everyone else in this world, well, in this country, hopefully those of us who are listening, is to stop purchasing these products which are causing suffering and harm to animals and are resulting in animals being killed. Okay. So I'd be much more interested in talking about the eggs that 99.99999% of people consume.
Right, and I get that, and we got that from my first guest. But I'm trying to nail precisely what the vegan's relationship to meat and to meat products.
Yeah.
Now, the second part of my chicken story is that, of course, foxes broke in, and foxes are not just carnivores; they're sadistic.
Yes.
And the coop was just destroyed, and there was feathers everywhere. It was a nightmare. Do you have an ethical problem with what the fox did to my chickens?
Well, no, because of course, if foxes don't have the same moral agency that we do, they don't have the same intellect that we do, and they can't rationalise their decisions in the same way that we can.
Right.
So in the same way that I wouldn't necessarily think down on wild animals who do lots of terrible things, I certainly would hope that we humans wouldn't partake in those things ourselves. Infanticide, rape, murder, wild animals commit these things to one another, but we would never justify those things within our own species just because wild animals such as foxes do them.
Right, so a human being who didn't have a normal human being's moral sense and they ate an animal product, that would be okay because they're operating purely on instinct and not higher intellect.
Well, not necessarily. I think when you say instinct, I'm referring to animals that don't have those capacities. But I think most humans have the sense of empathy, responsibility, morality. I think someone who is in the situation you're describing wouldn't necessarily have the ability to be able to function on their own in a kind of conceivable way. So they wouldn't be in a supermarket making the decision to buy steak.
So human beings are superior to animals.
Well, intellectually we are, but
Right.
superiority doesn't give us the justification to inflict harm onto others. That's a form of tyranny and oppression. And so we may be intellectually superior, if you want to use that word, to other animals, but that gives us a sense of responsibility to not abuse that power and to tyrannize over those who
Do
are...
we also have a moral responsibility to reduce harm being done against animals by other animals?
Oh, I think in some senses, yes. I mean, obviously, the remit there is far different, and what we'd be able to achieve is far different.
Right.
So
we don't want to police lions
exactly,
from chasing gazelle.
Exactly. But if we can limit the suffering of wild animals as well in sort of effective, efficient, and sort of not too interventionist type of ways, I think that would be a good thing to do as well.
See, one thinks of vegans, like other animal rights activists, as being very pro-nature, but it sounds to me a bit like you're actually suggesting human beings rising above nature, separate from it, like we're some kind of great alien godlike race that gets to manage the environment.
Well, no, I would argue that a godlike race would be one that acts with impunity over the immorality that inflicts upon others, which is very much the anti-vegan position, which is that we are dominant, therefore we can do as we wish to these animals that we view as being beneath us. The vegan position is that we should try and safeguard the lives of animals and humans on our planet, and as a consequence of that, it is a pro-nature position, but of course the vegan position is more about sort of opposing the forms of animal violence that we have direct control over, which of course in the farming scenarios we are the ones who are completely in control of that.
Inaya.
Ed, so when it comes to eating meat, would you agree that the main driver people do it, despite all of those arguments, is the pursuit of taste pleasure?
Yes.
So, and you believe that that's morally inferior to not doing that because you think the suffering outweighs that?
Well, what do you think? Do you think that pleasure should be a moral justifier for one's actions?
In some circumstances, yes. I mean, I would accept.
Can you tell me which one?
I would say that it is a moral good to cultivate human enjoyment, pleasure, satisfaction, warmth, comfort. So, for example, I think it would be morally justified to kill an animal if it meant that it might give you a warm clothes, for example.
Well, back in the day, if we were needed that fur to survive because we lived in harsh winters where we lived in caves, that'd be very different. But in a modern world where that argument doesn't hold up, then to kill an animal and skin them for their fur or to use their skin for clothing when we don't need to would be wrong. I'm interested to know, in a modern day context, is there anything that you wouldn't want to do to an animal in the name of pleasure?
Well, I think I was a vegetarian, as I said in the beginning, and actually I did find that there was something quite miserable about the fact that I would go past the KFC and feel extremely hungry. So in a scenario, for example, where we could eliminate the suffering caused by animal from meat consumption, but let's say in this scenario that people's pleasure and enjoyment and satisfaction that they got out of food reduced by a couple notches, would you still see that as a morally preferable situation to the one we have now?
Absolutely. In the same way, let's take people that engage in dog fighting or dog abusing.
Well, this is a much more wider practice. Obviously, eating meat is much wider than dog fighting.
If you want to justify the gassing of pigs in gas chambers because people enjoy 15 minutes of sensory pleasure when they consume a bacon sandwich, I think that's a very scary line to take.
I think it's quite interesting that you use the term gas chambers because obviously you're trying to kind of evoke.
Well, what are they? These are chambers that are filled with gas that are used to.
Because I think you're obviously trying to evoke, a kind of cultural memory.
No. You tell me what they are if they're not gas chambers. You tell me what they are then.
Well, personally, for me, I wouldn't defend factory farming. So
no. I'm asking you a very specific question. I'm asking you, if you think that I'm using gas chambers to be emotive, you tell me what phrase you would use to describe chambers that are filled with gas that are used specifically to kill sentient beings.
So I'm not defending the way in which factory farming practices take place. I think that there are many questionable justifications for that. Hold on, let me just finish. I'm also asking questions. I'm trying to understand that why you place more value on the reduction of animal suffering than what I would say is that many human beings take huge enrichment from the pursuit and cultivation of great food. And I'm not talking about very specific fringe examples like dog fighting and things like that. Actually, this is a almost near universal kind of human practice.
But the problem is the argument you're using, you're choosing an argument to justify individual behaviours. And if you're saying that pleasure is a moral justifier for doing things to animals, especially things so extreme as gas chambers... But not just
pleasure, satisfaction, warmth, comfort, enjoyment, engagement with our cultural heritage.
Yeah, but there's lots of examples of things around the world where that would be the case. But again, if we're talking about sort of cultural satisfaction and pleasure, let's say, for example, there was a culture around the world where sort of bestiality was a culturally ingrained normal practice.
Again, we're talking about something much more universal.
No, it may be more universal, but what I'm doing is I'm using our argument and applying it to another scenario where it could theoretically be justified. And so if we think about scenarios where things could be done to animals in the name of pleasure, most of those things we'd find to be morally reprehensible, regardless of the amount of pleasure that it provided to the oppressor. I think that pleasure is a very, very dangerous justification, because some of the worst things that humans and do to other humans or do to other animals are done in the name of pleasure, whether that be sensory pleasure and emotional pleasure that comes from gratification, from feeling powerful and dominant. These are very scary justifications to use. And I think that if we start using these justifications to condone throat slitting, gas chambers, or whatever term you want to use to describe gas chambers, I think that's a very scary society that we end up in.
Ed Winters, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.